And for myself, I'd like to honor and acknowledge that the land I reside on is in the traditional territory of the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples. It's now known as Arvada, Colorado. And so for folks joining us in the chat, if you could drop in your name, your location, and your native land if you know it. Then also the organization that you're affiliated with, if any, and then the type of organization or role you're in. So whether you're a community member, you're in a grassroots nonprofit organization, et cetera. So you'll see my example, which is right there. Everyone, I'm Subin Devar, and I'm in Denver, the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. I'm with the Initiative for Energy Justice, which is a movement support nonprofit research center that I'm going to share a little bit more about as we get into our presentation. So thank you, folks, for joining us, and folks, just go ahead and continue to drop in your introductions as we move through. I'll give it another couple of minutes though while folks are on this slide. All right, I see a lot of introductions pouring in, folks from all around the country. All right, while folks are continuing doing that, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Soon as, actually, just to give people a little bit more time, why don't you skip this slide? We'll go to the agenda, give people a little bit more time to drop in their introductions, and we'll come back and do a quick little poll. So just to give you a brief roadmap today, we're going to be thoroughly reviewing a guide recently put out by the Initiative for Energy Justice and Vote Solar, Amp Up the People. And this guide provides tools and strategies for empowering advocates and communities to participate in utility decision-making processes and to advance energy justice. We'll first present an overview of the guide, including background information on utility regulation, insights into proceedings that affect energy justice and engagement strategies. Then we'll present on 3 case studies and recommendations to address inequities in utility regulation. And finally, we'll hold time for questions and discussion. All right, we're going to do a quick little poll. Just to get to know you all a little bit better. So you'll see that pop up and be up for about a minute. And the question is just, what's your familiarity participating in utility regulatory proceedings? And then you'll see you can select an answer, the 5 choices. It'll be up for about a minute. All right, if you haven't selected an answer yet, just gonna populate those who are able to do that. So, all right, well, you should be able to see those poll results there. We just wanted to give everyone just a sense of who's in the room and the range of knowledge, and it's pretty cool to see. The largest majorities are folks who consider themselves novice or comfortable with utility regulatory proceedings, followed by folks that are advanced beginners and then proficient and experts. So thanks for sharing that with us. And we will, I will turn to introduce our panelists next. So my name again is Subin Devar. I'm the co-executive director, operations and partners, as well as a co-founder of the Initiative for Energy Justice, and I'll just be moderating, facilitating today. We'll have two main presenters. Greer Ryan is the Regulatory Director, Education and Innovation for Vote Solar's Regulatory Advocacy Hub. In this role, she focuses on regulatory education, training, and utility reform thought leadership to support a just, equitable, and clean energy system for all. Prior to Vote Solar, Greer worked at Climate Solutions as a clean buildings policy manager, where she led efforts to advance equitable building electrification and gas system transition policy solutions at the Oregon legislature and state agencies. Before Climate Solutions, Greer was a senior energy policy analyst at the Center for Biological Diversity, focused on energy justice solutions related to distributed solar and utility accountability. We'll also be joined by Kelly Sheehan, who is the co-executive director of programs and policy of the Initiative for Energy Justice. She has 25 years of experience in the environmental movement, bringing vision, strategy, and policy expertise to address the climate crisis and advance an equity-centered transition to clean energy. Prior to joining IEJ, she founded EcoKey Partners to provide leadership and executive capacity for environmental and social change organizations, and served as the Senior Director of Energy Campaigns at the Sierra Club. I'm excited to have both Greer and Kelly with us today, and you'll get to hear from them both in turn. I'll share a little bit more about our organizations and this guide before I hand it over. The Initiative for Energy Justice conducts research, provides policy analysis, and facilitates dialogue to advance concrete policy pathways towards energy justice. IEJ partners with frontline organizing groups and allies striving for universal access to affordable, renewable, and democratically managed energy. Vote Solar is an advocacy or nonprofit with a mission to realize a 100% clean energy future through a solutions-driven, people-first approach. Vote Solar advances just and equitable clean energy policy in state legislatures and public commissions across the U.S., bridging communities and diverse stakeholders together to forge inclusive coalitions and winning campaigns. Go to the next slide. So just a little bit about the guide, whether you've already seen it, skimmed it, or you haven't seen it at all. At a high level, the AMP Up guide aims to ensure that frontline communities, those disproportionately harmed by fossil fuel pollution, threatened by power cutoffs, and burdened by high energy costs, can better understand and actively engage in the energy transition. We also created this guide to serve as a valuable resource for energy justice advocates by simplifying the intricacies of utility regulation and providing essential tools, resources, and strategies. This guide would not have been possible without the support of our trusted partners, dedicated student researchers, and the invaluable contributions of our internal staff who thoughtfully brought the information together that it contains. And in the report, in the beginning pages, you'll find a full list of all the people that we really wanted to recognize. So now I'll hand it over to Greer for an overview of the guide, including background information on utility regulation, insights, and engagement strategies.
Thanks, Subin, and hi, everyone. Great to see so many friendly names on the participant list here. And then lots of folks who are newer to the space, which is really exciting. That's exactly what we're hoping to see with this guide. So just basic background, some of the core content of the guide includes some information on utility regulation that's just pretty intro level, basically some background on utility regulators, who's actually authorized to approve or deny requests from our investor-owned utilities, ones that are regulated, key terms and their explanations. We have a glossary of terms at the end of the guide. We also dig into insights into different proceeding types, also dockets. This is all just utility regulation terminology, but we go through it in the report, that affect energy justice issues, or in which advocates or communities can bring energy justice issues forward. We talk about engagement strategies, and I'll get into a little bit more of this in the next few slides, but some tips and tricks to better engage, as well as some recommendations to address inequities within utility regulation. Next slide, please. As far as background on utility regulation goes, some of the key concepts we dig into are kind of understanding the role of utility regulators at the state level, including, we say PUCs here, but that's public utility commissions, sometimes called public service commissions or other names, depending on the state that you're in. We also talk about regional authorities like ISOs and RTOs. All of that are, cross-state agencies that regulate the wholesale side of our energy system. We introduce terms like interventions, proceedings, and dockets, and kind of try to explain the difference between those. And we dig into why engaging at PUCs actually matters, like what can be accomplished, what happens when there isn't engagement, some of the big kind of hard-hitting issues of our time. Next slide, please. As far as digging into proceedings that affect energy justice, we focus on a handful of example proceedings and proceeding types. Rate cases, for instance, are where utilities might say, we want to change the amount that we're charging our customers for the energy that they use, or for the system as a whole. And they have to demonstrate why they're asking for that change. And there's an opportunity for both state agencies, the regulators themselves, as well as ratepayer advocates, as well as third-party organizations, to kind of kick the tires on that request, so to speak, to decide, to help the commission decide, is this actually a worthwhile change? Does this work for customers? Does this work for the utility? And a lot of rate cases, kind of where the rubber hits the road. I'm using a lot of car analogies for some reason today, but where really important decisions are made about kind of the dollars and cents that go into our energy system, and what's built, what's not built, who has to pay for it. We go into renewable portfolio standards, which are state level policies that determine how much clean energy or renewable energy sources are expected to be built or expected to be used by utilities in coming years. We talk about resource planning, which is generally integrated resource plans, but sometimes distributed system planning or other types of long-term planning, where utilities say, here's what we're planning on building, here's what we're planning on procuring over a long-term time frame, as well as often a short-term time frame as part of that, and why we're planning on doing that, whether it's customer demand or other issues. We talk a bit about energy affordability proceedings, utility shutoff proceedings, whether or not utilities can or should be able to shut off power for customers, depending on things like whether or not they've been able to pay their bills, as well as utility-initiated power shutoffs, often for safety or reliability reasons, such as to prevent wildfires, and then a handful of other proceeding types. Next slide, please. Here's an example of some of the content that we show for, proceeding types. We talk about rate cases, and in doing so, we try to highlight key terms. We try to talk about the equity components that go into these types of proceedings, and some ways in which advocates or communities might think about what issues to bring up and to look at within those proceedings. Next slide, please. We also try to provide some resources for folks who say, we don't know where to start. We've never done utility commission work before. This is a pretty wonky space. It can be pretty confusing. And depending on the issue that you're interested in, there might be a variety of different ways to engage. Again, this is just an example from the report, but if you're interested in energy affordability, you might start with rate cases and look at energy affordability program dockets. If you're interested in getting off of fossil fuels and onto clean energy resources, you might look at long-term resource plans, IRPs, or clean energy rulemakings, as an example. Similarly with shutoffs, there might be disconnection policy dockets. There might be opportunities for providing some kind of consumer complaints directly to the commission. None of this is meant to be exhaustive. Depending on the state that you're in, there might be other opportunities, investigations. They might have an office of public participation you can reach out to, but this is just to get the wheels turning. Next slide, please. We also dig into some engagement strategies. This is the tips and tricks section I mentioned. Whether it's how to find information on PUC websites, which are often pretty outdated and kind of cumbersome to navigate. We talk about, understanding not just individual case types, but general concepts of case types, whether they're formal or informal, what that means, if they're contested or uncontested, what that means. And then the general process for intervening as an official participant within a case. We provide some tips to engage in those different types of proceedings, whether they're informal or formal, as well as some tips to find legal and technical support, which is often critical, especially in more formal proceedings. Next slide. And again, this and the next slide are just kind of examples from the guide. I don't expect folks to be able to read this, especially because it's kind of small on the screen here, but just the beginning of the section on finding information on websites. Some of this might seem obvious to folks who've been around in this space for a while, but isn't something that anyone teaches in school, really. It's not something that we learn in any way, usually, except by doing. So we tried to include some general tips like using the search tool and finding a page like e-dockets or filings. There's no reason that folks should know that that's where you might go to find specific proceedings, but that is usually the starting point, as well as keeping an eye out for notices from agency staff. And again, a couple examples of tips for a contested proceeding, like a rate case, as well as kind of what it means to intervene and whether or not you might try to consider finding intervener compensation, which some states offer. And then some overview of how to find some technical or legal assistance. Okay, next slide. I think I pass it back to you, Subin.
Yes, thank you, Greer, for providing that overview of the background, insights, the strategies in the guide. And for everyone who's joined us, the guide is lengthy. We wanted to walk through it, but we also want to make sure we get your questions. So I forgot to mention at the start, if you have questions while we're going through the presentation, feel free to use the question feature in Zoom, the built-in one. You'll see like the little Q&A box in your menu, wherever that appears on your Zoom screen. But if you can't find that, and if it's easier to get to the chat, you can drop it in there and I'll try to pull those together at the end. Thanks again, Greer, and I'll hand it over now to Kelly to present the 3 case studies that are in the guide and recommendations to address inequities in utility regulation.
Thank you. I'm Kelly Sheehan. I'm the co-executive director along with Subin for the Initiative for Energy Justice, and I live in Asheville, North Carolina, which is the traditional homeland of the Cherokee, the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And I wanted to share a little bit more about the case studies here. So there's 3 case studies. The first 2 are in Colorado and Michigan. And those are where we looked, or specifically the UC Berkeley researchers who were working with, in partnership with Vote Solar, conducted semi-structured interviews with community members in Colorado and in Michigan to look at two different proceedings and to examine kind of why community members got involved, what the issues were, and what was at stake. And then the third one in Massachusetts, which was a little bit different. So in Colorado, this was around Xcel Energy, who is the investor-owned utility there. They had a renewable energy standard plan that was to come in line with the state's goal of transitioning to 100% renewable energy by 2040. And so then the utility, as is the case in many places where the state will have some kind of climate law or decarbonization plan, and then the utility submits to the utility commission about how they'll achieve that. And then people like us have the opportunity, community members and others have the opportunity to come weigh in and give testimony or recommendations, or participate in public hearings, or participate with expert testimony and that sort of thing. So in this case, Xcel had submitted its plan for how it would meet the clean energy goals. And it did so with a wide ranging variety, everything from extending more fossil gas, which isn't renewable or clean, and all the way into plans for solar, wind, and energy storage. And communities intervened for a couple main reasons. And one was around community solar. Xcel was supposed to release funds and they were behind schedule on releasing them for community solar projects that would allow access to community solar, would allow access for more people than just those who could afford to put solar panels on their own homes or apartments. And so that's often something we see in energy as a means for energy justice, is this ability to participate even if you don't have the cash up front to put solar panels on your own residence, but want to pool with your community. And so that was one reason why they intervened, and also was to advocate for microgrids. And in this case, the plan was around microgrids for commercial customers, but not for residential. And so the community members intervened to be able to get, speak up for microgrids being accessible for residential customers as well. Next slide. And the other case study that the UC Berkeley researchers conducted interviews on was in Michigan. And so this was around a proceeding that had DTE, which is the investor-owned utility in Michigan. They had a plan to transition to cleaner energy. And this was through an integrated resource plan, which is one of the main it's kind of one of the main things that an investor-owned utility will put in front of the Utilities Commission to explain and justify their long-term plans for looking at what kind of energy, how much energy will be needed, what the makeup of the energy sources, et cetera. And so this plan included things like customer incentives for clean energy or energy efficiency, workforce development, and some transformation of the infrastructure. And the advocates here also intervened for microgrids to advocate for more localized and decentralized energy systems, also for affordability, which of course is a big issue in energy justice, overall affordability for clean energy, because DTE has a really bad track record on this. And so advocates were watching for that and wanted to engage. And then the last piece was around a specific coal plant closure in Michigan. That was a really polluting coal plant. And the issue at hand here was who was going to pay for the closure of the coal plant and the replacement energy. And of course, frontline communities were looking for those costs to be borne by DTE and not by customers. Next slide. And then the last one that we looked at was different. This wasn't with the researchers from UC Berkeley, but this was really analyzing and talking with people that were involved with the Massachusetts Attorney General Stakeholder Working Group, who had identified barriers to participation for energy decision-making. And this was looking at, they did hundreds of surveys, interviews, and some focus groups to look at really the procedures at the Department of Public Utilities, which is the Massachusetts PUC. Like Griff said, they're called something different in most states. That may be a public service commission or a public utilities commission. In this case, it's the Department of Public Utilities. And then also at the Energy Facilities Siting Board, which has makes decisions about where different energy projects can be built in compliance with different zoning regulations and things like that. And what this resulted in a really awesome report that's called Overly Impacted and Rarely Heard, incorporating community voices into Massachusetts energy regulatory processes. And it had a whole bunch of findings and recommendations that really mirrored what the other two case studies found as well, that I'll go into in just one sec. And I also wanted to name that one of the things that came up here, and it was, it's similar in other states too, is that there is sometimes a disconnect between the state's climate legislation for states that have that and some of the underlying procedures for how utilities and energy decisions are being made. And those may be formal or informal protocols that are the ways things happen at a utilities commission. So thinking about how to make sure those are aligned is an important thing for us to be looking for. So the next slide. Here's what generally came out as some of the main findings across all three of these case studies. One of the biggest one was accessibility. So this was one of the most profound barriers for frontline communities and for Black and Indigenous and people of color communities to engage or participate in the proceedings. If meetings, for example, are during work hours, during working class hours, or are only located in the Capitol in person, it makes it harder for people who are not living in that in the Capitol, or for people who are needing to be at work to participate in public hearings. And so that is one of the biggest takeaways that we found as a pattern of inequity within the intervention process at the PUCs. The another big one was around language justice. And this is both translation services and making sure that the information is available in multiple languages, or that there's translation services available, but it's also around technical expertise. So when some of these, again, like Greer said, a lot of these proceedings can be fairly technical and wonky, and yet many of the utilities commissions want to hear from folks in communities and not just experts in energy. And in order to do so, they need to be able to provide less the information with less complex vocabulary and with more accessible plain language to understand the decisions that are being made. A couple more that I'll name, but we go into detail, of course, in the report, is these really lengthy and unclear processes, providing a more succinct understanding of what a rate case or an integrated resource plan or these different proceedings or dockets will mean is a way to engage more people. There's also often capacity constraints from organizations, and that could include financial or bandwidth. And so having things like compensation for intervening is a good way to overcome that burden. There's also a lack of class and race consciousness. And what we mean there is that sometimes the language that's being used in these PUCs is not tailored to how community members identify And there isn't, without that, without understanding kind of who is most burdened and the history around environmental injustices, without naming as much, it really kind of doesn't create a welcoming or inclusive environment for folks to be engaged. Next slide. And so the recommendations to overcome this, that we provide in the report, one is what we call improving access and community engagement by using a people first approach. So having better and more comprehensive community outreach programs, having more opportunities, and you'll see this in some of the states. It's really varied across the country and how well the PUCs do this. But going out into communities, having remote locations or after hours locations for public hearings, having this race and class conscious lens in the language that is used, and the opportunities to engage, having language services, and having compensation for interveners are some of the suggestions, again, for overcoming those barriers. And the other piece is really democratizing the public utility commissions. Often the PUCs are predominantly across the country are led by white men, upper class men, often who have a background in working for the utilities themselves. And so having utilities commissions that represent the communities that they serve in terms of a diversity of backgrounds and race and class can help create a more equitable system or the conditions for more people to engage. So that's the other big recommendation that we had. Next slide. So how we envision this guide being used, one is for, whether this is, whether you're a seasoned advocate or you're newer to the work, this is a guide that can really help folks understand the regulatory landscape, how decisions are being made about energy. And that could be, when it comes to energy justice, that can be around what are our generation sources. Are they clean, or are they prolonging the life of fossil fuels? Are they accessible to all different kinds of people or only to wealthy white folks? Are they available in a distributed way, or are we continuing the model of having baseload power, right? These are the places where decisions are being made. And so that's why it's important for us to understand the regulatory landscape. We also envision it as being a tool that helps with the tips that we've suggested about engaging effectively with public utilities commissions, or for finding advocates or legal representation if you want to go deep into it, versus if you want to just show up and testify at a public hearing. And lastly, for leveraging some of the resources and case studies to provide a deeper look in your own states or communities. So with that, I will hand it back to Subin.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate your covering the case studies, or findings and the recommendations in the AMP-UP guide. And before we turn to questions, though, while I'm about to introduce this, I hope you all are thinking of questions that have come up, and go ahead and you can start to enter those questions, and we'll turn in a second to start asking our panelists to answer them. Again, you can either use the questions feature or the chat to pose your question. Before that, we wanted to, before we start answering those questions, we want to ask this little poll that you should see pop up. What are the most important issues to you? If you could choose up to 3 choices: keeping utilities affordable and stopping shutoffs, community having a real voice in utility decisions, making utilities answer to the community, protection from climate impacts and environmental harm, or developing local energy solutions. You can select more than one, select up to 3. And after the poll, we're limited by the poll, so there's not an open-ended option here, but we can also hear from folks if there's important issues to you that aren't included here. So this will be open for a little bit, and then we'll see the results. And while that's about to close, if you haven't answered it, get your answer in. And if you've already answered it, I hope you're thinking about some questions to ask Greer and Kelly. So please pop those in. I see some of them coming in now. All right, we're going to close the poll and turn to questions. All right, if you're able to see that, I love it. There we have answers across the board. You can take a second to see a lot of responses around protection from climate and environmental harm, as well as communities having a real voice in utility decisions. Right, thank you for offering that. Well, again, I want to invite you to offer your questions. If you don't have a question yet, if there was an issue that's important to you that you didn't see on that list, if you want to drop that and name that in the chat, we invite that as well too. And in the meantime, I'll turn to the questions that we have so far, and may pepper in questions as well myself as we have those. So one question is, are these efforts to democratize utility commissions limited to only energy, or are you also focusing on water, sewer, etc., that could become critical areas as well? Either of you like to talk about that context?
I guess the short answer from Vote Solar is that we tend to focus on the energy space, but there are definitely organizations that are focused on water utilities as well. And it's a great question because there is so much overlap with kind of underlying issues around affordability and utility accountability when it comes to these what should be in my belief kind of basic human rights. So maybe we could in the next resource that we work on try to point to some organizations that focus more on the water or other utility side of things. I think that's a great suggestion. And I don't know, Kelly, if you have anything to add.
I would say same with IEJ that we have a small team and we're focused as well on energy. Another overlap I see is that sometimes there's local entities that will run a local water program or a city water utility. I've wondered about, but it's not an area I've dived into that much about the ability for there being some places that gives them some expertise to also run a local utility for electric or energy. But it's not a focus of ours, water or sewer or other utilities.
Thank you. Another question, other than the current lawsuit before the California Supreme Court regarding net energy metering 3.0, NEM 3.0, what actions can we take to reverse that decision? I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that. You can also name a couple more, or Greer, did you want to jump in?
Just, the California's had a couple of actions recently that have been really kind of hard to see from the community and rooftop solar perspective. Certainly California is in an interesting position relative to other states. So one thing I'd say for all the folks who aren't in California is that if similar arguments are coming up about rolling back compensation for community or local solar solutions like rooftop solar, and then California is pointed to as an example, I would be really wary of that because California does have a very specific kind of set of challenges when it comes to energy affordability and their grid. In California specifically, we have some folks on our team who are Western states focused, and one of the priorities is to get, and at least from Vote Solar, is to get California to think about the benefits, the many different types of benefits that local solar and storage solutions can provide, to think about those a little bit more robustly than you commissions have traditionally thought of. So that might include things like resilience benefits or avoided land use benefits, having solar on existing structures instead of in natural wildlife habitat or on tribal lands that are significant or other things, like trying to capture those benefits in a meaningful way. The state of California has a lot of work to do there, and there are some active proceedings in front of both the California PUC and the California Energy Commission that might be worth looking into on that issue. That might be more information than the person was asking for, and maybe not specific enough, but that's what I'd suggest.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions related to bills and rates, both if rate increases that have already happened. One person mentioned that their bill increased over the last 3 to 4 months. And then there's another question specifically about a rate increase in Colorado. I don't know if either of you are familiar with proposed rate increases in Colorado. But is there anything that you would share just for folks thinking about what they can do both in learning or in taking action if considering rates is something that they're concerned about?
I feel like I'm overdoing it with answers, but I'm going to go ahead and chime in on the Colorado PUC case. It's a very specific question, but Vote Solar has engaged in that with our Interior West team, and a lot of what we're asking for at this point within that case is for Colorado and the commission to better consider, again, local solar and storage potential. We call it distributed energy resources, or DERs, in this, as well as how the kind of different mechanisms for analyzing and then compensating for the cost of solar are considered. We've worked in partnership with groups like Solar United Neighbors and Grid Alternatives, Green Latinos, and Mothers Out Front on this particular docket, and are going to continue to engage. If you want to reach out to hear more from our team on that, I would totally encourage it. And then, just want to express serious sympathy about the increase in bills. This is something we're seeing across the country. It is a very real crisis, energy affordability, and it is coming at the same time that we're seeing the climate crisis unfold, real, energy system harms that are resulting in kind of life or death situations for folks in many cases. I think advocates who are working in this space are trying to balance the fact that some investments will be needed to create a more resilient system, a safer system for everyone, and to create programs that particularly protect the communities that need different kinds of safeguards the most, whether those are low-income affordability programs or programs to set up more affordable access to climate solutions like local solar. But every time you ask for a utility to spend more money that is paid for by ratepayers, that can have a bill impact. So I would say, one kind of critical space, and we go into this bit in the guide, is to look at things like rate cases and long-term planning, and to say, okay, well, where do we want our dollars and cents to go as members of this community, as people who have very real, who feel those very real impacts in our bills? Bring your stories to commissioners, say, this is how I'm experiencing this is where I want my money to go. And, maybe point out the things that you don't want your money to be spent on, whether it's executive compensation or higher returns for investors, or building out the fossil fuel system, any number of those things. And in general, don't feel like you have to have all the answers. I think speaking from personal experience and kind of sharing your story is extremely powerful and very needed in these spaces.
Sometimes I'd offer to just that, thanks for all that, Greer. I think that's, super helpful and insightful. And some states, there's also a consumer advocate. Sometimes they're more helpful than others, but they are a place to see if the perspective of the inequities of an energy burden are being shared or uplifted in these proceedings or not. They can be a helpful source of information. So add that as well to the mix. Simon, do you have any thoughts?
I think nothing to add to what you both shared, but yeah, so I appreciate that. I have one more question here, which actually is along the lines of something that we wanted to turn to, which is also to ask more, to invite feedback from you all as well too. You can go to the next slide while we also, while I take this question in the chat, which is, would there be value in gaining community presence at some of the many NARUC meetings across the year? Let me see if I can remember the acronym. I think it's the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Probably close. At those forums, in addition to state proceedings. And I could take a stab at answering this a little bit, as well as you see on the screen, gonna maybe invite some more feedback from folks as well too, which is I think one of the things we've been thinking about after, working on this report is that working directly within the utility regulatory system, is a space in which there's certainly a lot more participation that we could encourage, and we need that. And then in addition to that, what else is really needed for communities to really be able to shape the electric system? So I love this idea, just to think more broadly around the larger ecosystem of folks that are involved, commissioners. There's also other national organizations. There's another acronym that's very similar, NASIO. I think it's the National Association of State Energy Officials. And what are other ways for increasing participation in that broader group of energy regulatory professionals, such that community voices and community needs could be at the forefront? Anything, Greer or Kelly, that you would want to add to that in response to that question?
I might add that those meetings are often pretty expensive to officially attend, which is unfortunate. And then, often there are organizations that participate as kind of third-party participants, so not the regulators themselves, not their staff, but different kinds of nonprofits or think tanks that end up showing up to those kinds of meetings. So it might be worth it if an individual is considering bringing forward issues to those kinds of meetings, reaching out to those organizations that might already be attending and seeing if there's a way to collaborate or volunteer with them for that. There's also sometimes side meetings that happen, or there could be side events that I see no reason why community groups can't host or try to help host, and without actually spending the money on participating in these multi-$1,000 sometimes events. That could be another way to engage, but it is I would say, unfortunately, those spaces are not often super open to the public at this stage.
And for folks, what we're wondering also, just to hear from those of you who have joined us, is what do you think is needed next, beyond a guide like this, or similar efforts to support community engagement and utility regulation? So welcome your thoughts in the chat. And I want to turn also, Greer and Kelly, to ask you a question along the same lines. After working on the guide, what are you both thinking about as opportunities that might create possibilities for expanding participation in utility regulation.
I was reading this question that just came in about the current efforts and focus with the new administration. So I might have missed your exact question. So Ben, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. And we can take that question too. I just asked if, in addition to, as responses come in around like what's needed to support community engagement in utility regulation, what either of you, Kelly or Greer, are thinking about after working on the guide as to what opportunities are arising that you think might create possibilities for expanding participation and community engagement in utility regulation.
Yes, and I wanted it dovetails with the question about our new administration. I definitely think, we made so much progress with the Inflation Reduction Act and with the bipartisan infrastructure law that has unlocked a lot of money to states and cities and individuals for advancing clean energy. And a lot of that is already out the door. And so I think defending that will be important. And I also think there's a lot of opportunity to work in states and local jurisdictions to advance clean energy. And that might be some of the things we've just been talking about with this guide and being active in advancing long-range plans for the utilities at PUCs. It also may be advocating for more distributed solar, wind, more energy efficiency or energy storage. That could be on a localized level as well. So I certainly think that we will be making pivots to as a community, of people who care about the climate crisis and about energy justice, to more state and local level work. While of course there'll be some work needed to defend what we have secured at the federal level as well. But surely we won't be seeing advancements in, I think it would be highly unlikely for us to see advancements in clean energy regulation under this administration. And I also would just name that what's on my mind is, we're all living through more and more climate disasters that are come from a long, decades-long, centuries-long reliance on fossil fuels that have accelerated in recent decades. And I live in Asheville, where we just experienced Hurricane Helene, 500 miles inland from the coast, with extreme storm damage and flooding that left us without power and water and communication for weeks. And we just got potable water back last week, I guess, after 53 days. And so it is definitely on my mind of like, what happens as we rebuild from these climate disasters that are happening all over the country and of course all over the globe. Are there ways that we can build resiliency more into a distributed generation now? And what are the ways that we can have more microgrids and more resilient infrastructure, or build back in a different way after these massive events? For certainly, most of the control was in the hands of Duke Energy. And I will say that, they rebuilt in ways that had people from nearby states linemen working to get power restored. The places that came back quickest were places that had microgrids and were able to be not reliant on all of the entire system. But we worry very much so about where those costs for rebuilding the same exact infrastructure will come, like who will bear that, who will pay for that in the end, and will that come from increasing rates or not? And I think that moving toward more clean, resilient, distributed system is in the best, is really kind of the best idea as we are facing more climate disasters.
Thank you, Kelly. As we're wrapping up, I just want to acknowledge the great ideas that also folks shared in the chat. In terms of making it easier for people to be aware of meetings and events, easier to municipalize. And there's a couple other questions that we didn't get to. On this slide here, you could see how to, there was a question about getting the guide. So at our websites at votesolar.org or iejusa.org, you could definitely download the guide. It's free. Doesn't require a donation. You can also email us if we are not like sending everyone who's attended the slides directly. So if you're interested in the slides, just email us and we can send you those. But all the material is just the same that's in the guides. So just want to take a last moment to thank our panelists, Greer and Kelly, and as well as Uche, our communications director at the Initiative for Energy Justice, for providing technical support, and all of you for joining us today. If you missed part of the webinar, or if you have anyone else that you'd like to share it with, we'll also post a recording of the webinar on our website, iejusa.org, pretty soon after this event. Thanks again, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.